Tiny home village that attracted attention for sitting vacant finally has something to celebrate, an official and finally funded grand opening.
On a cold January night in Seattle, a volunteer count found more than 18,000 people experiencing homelessness across the region. Only New York and Los Angeles have more. Nearly 2 out of every 3 of those people were sleeping outside, in tents under highway overpasses, in doorways downtown, in cars parked on quiet residential streets. But Seattle has an answer to this that costs less than a used car. Scattered across the city are small villages of brightly painted wooden houses, each one about the size of a garden shed, 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, with a locked door, a window, heat, and a real bed. Each one costs about $4,500 in materials. And for the people who live in them, that little wooden box is often the difference between surviving and not. So today we're going inside Seattle's tiny house villages to see how people actually live there, why the city keeps building more of them, and whether a $4,500 house can really solve a problem this big. To understand why these villages exist, you first have to understand what they replaced. A tent on a Seattle sidewalk barely counts as shelter. The nylon walls do almost nothing against the Pacific Northwest rain, which falls about 150 days a year. There's no lock, so everything you own can be stolen while you sleep, and people who live in encampments will tell you it usually is. There's no heat in winter, no way to cool down in summer, no address for a job application, no place to store medication, and no door to close when you just need the world to stop for a few hours. And in a hard, cold snap, a tent can turn deadly. Almost every winter, the county's records include people who simply froze outside, sometimes just blocks from buildings with heat. And then there are the sweeps. City crews arrive, sometimes with little warning, and clear the encampment. People lose their tents, their documents, their photographs, their medications. Then they move a few blocks away and start over. For years, this cycle repeated across Seattle. The tents came back. The suffering came back. Nothing actually changed. Seattle's homeless residents saw this cycle more clearly than anyone, and some of them decided to fight it. Back in 2008, a group of campers facing yet another sweep set up a defiant encampment of bright pink tents and named it Nicholsville, a sarcastic jab at then-Mayor Greg Nichols, the man ordering the sweeps. The message was simple: if the city keeps scattering us, we'll build something it can't ignore. For years, Nicholsville and camps like it bounced from lot to lot, hosted by churches and sympathetic landowners. They were controversial, and they were far from perfect. But they proved something that would matter enormously later. Homeless residents could organize themselves, agree on rules, run security shifts, and keep a camp safer than the open street. The city took notice. And when the tiny house idea arrived years later, those self-organized camps became the foundation it was built on. Now, the obvious answer would seem to be traditional homeless shelters. Seattle has them. But many homeless residents refuse to go, and the reason comes down to what the shelter asks them to give up. Most traditional shelters separate men and women, which means a married couple who has been together for 30 years gets split up at the door. Most don't allow pets, and for someone who has lost everything else, a dog is not negotiable. Many have strict limits on belongings, lines that form in the afternoon, and mats on a crowded floor next to strangers. You leave in the morning with everything you own on your back, and you line up again at night. For someone in their 60s or 70s, or anyone managing a health condition, that routine isn't just exhausting. It can be physically impossible. Outreach workers in Seattle heard the same thing over and over. I'm not leaving my partner. I'm not leaving my dog. I'm not sleeping next to 80 strangers. So in 2015, a nonprofit called the Low Income Housing Institute tried something different. Instead of one big building, what if you gave each person a small, simple structure of their own? 4 walls, a roof, a door that locks. They called them tiny house shelters, and they were built, quite deliberately, as a replacement for tents. So what do you actually get for $4,500? The houses are simple wooden structures, 8 feet by 12 feet, about 96 square feet inside. That's smaller than most American bedrooms. But every house is fully insulated. Every house has electricity, a heater, and in the newer builds, air conditioning for the summer heat waves. There's a real bed with real bedding, a window that lets in daylight, and smoke detectors. And the feature residents mention more than any other, a door with a lock, and they hold the key. Think about what that lock means if you've been living outside. It means you can sleep deeply for the first time in months, maybe years, without one ear open for footsteps. It means your ID, your medication, and your late mother's photographs are still there when you wake up. Sleep researchers will tell you that chronic sleep deprivation destroys judgment, memory, and health. People coming off the street often describe the first weeks in a tiny house the same way. They mostly just slept. Now, the houses don't have plumbing. There's no bathroom or kitchen inside, and we'll get to how that works in a moment. But that's also part of why they're so cheap and so fast to build. Because here's the other remarkable thing. Most of these houses aren't built by construction companies. They're built by volunteers. A nonprofit called Sound Foundations Northwest runs what they call a tiny house factory, staffed almost entirely by volunteers, many of them retirees. Church groups build them. High school shop classes build them. Walk into the factory on a weekday morning and you'll see retirees in dust masks running saws and nail guns, framing walls on assembly jigs, while a whiteboard on the wall tracks which village each finished house is headed to. Many of the volunteers are in their 60s and 70s themselves, former carpenters, engineers, nurses, and teachers who wanted their retirement to build something they could point to. Local artists and school groups paint the finished houses, which is a big part of why the villages look more like rows of beach cottages than anything you'd associate with a shelter. At full speed, the volunteer crews finish 3 to 4 houses every single week, each one for about $4,500 in lumber, insulation, wiring, and paint. Then, the finished houses are loaded onto trailers and delivered to a village. And the village is where this model either works or falls apart. A single tiny house on a sidewalk would just be a nicer tent. So Seattle doesn't place them alone. The houses are arranged in organized villages, usually somewhere between 20 and 50 homes on a fenced lot, often on land provided by the city, the county, or a church. Picture rows of small, colorful houses, red, teal, yellow, arranged along gravel paths, with garden beds between them and a covered common area in the middle. Every village has a shared kitchen where residents cook meals, hygiene trailers with real showers, real toilets, and laundry machines. Staff offices near the gate, and this matters, staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every resident gets a case manager. This is the piece most people never hear about. The house handles tonight. The case manager handles what comes next. Replacing a lost birth certificate and social security card because you can't rent an apartment or take a job without ID. Getting connected to healthcare, mental health treatment, or substance abuse treatment for those who need it. Applying for benefits. Applying for housing. Practicing for job interviews. Life in the village comes with structure, too. Residents attend regular community meetings where they make decisions together and work out conflicts. Most villages run daily litter patrols, where residents walk the surrounding blocks picking up trash, partly to be good neighbors, partly because it changes how the neighborhood sees them, and partly because it changes how they see themselves. There's a code of conduct that bans violence and stealing, and guests have to check in at the gate. And unlike most traditional shelters, the villages say yes to the things that keep people outside. Couples stay together in the same house. Pets are welcome. Your belongings stay in your locked home. In one recently opened village in the Lake City neighborhood, 45 units were set aside specifically for individuals, couples, and people with pets, the exact groups traditional shelters turn away. So how does someone actually get one of these houses? Mostly through outreach. When the city clears an encampment now, outreach workers arrive before the cleanup crews do, walking tent to tent with a concrete offer, a small house with a locking door, sometimes available that very week. And that changes the entire conversation. An offer people actually want turns a sweep from pure displacement into a doorway. Referrals also come from hospitals, veterans organizations, and caseworkers across the county. And there is almost always a waiting list because demand for these little houses far outstrips the supply. So, what does an ordinary day actually look like? For many residents, it looks almost boring, and that's the point. You wake up in a warm bed, in a room that's yours, and the rain on the roof is just weather now, not an emergency. You walk to the hygiene trailer and take a hot shower without a time limit shouted through a door. You make coffee in the shared kitchen and talk with neighbors who know your name. Maybe you have a case management appointment at 10. Maybe you catch the bus to a job, and plenty of residents work. Because it turns out holding a job is dramatically easier when you have somewhere to sleep, shower, and store clean clothes. In the evening, there might be a community dinner, donated and served by a local church group or neighborhood volunteers. Then you go home, lock your door, and sleep. Village life isn't perfect. Neighbors argue like neighbors anywhere, and residents who break the code of conduct can be asked to leave. But after months or years in a tent, most residents describe that ordinary routine as almost disorienting. One phrase comes up again and again in interviews from these villages. For the first time in years, I feel like a person. And walk the gravel paths of one of these villages, and the residents themselves will surprise you. Yes, some are working through addiction or mental illness, and the villages connect them to treatment. But you'll also meet seniors on fixed incomes who were priced out of their apartments. People discharged from a hospital with nowhere to recover. Workers with jobs whose wages simply stopped covering Seattle rent. Women in their 60s and 70s who lost a husband, and with him, half the household income. And you'll meet veterans. In nearly every village, there are men and women who served this country and still ended up sleeping outside. Some are in their 60s and 70s now. They followed the rules. They wore the uniform. And one bad year, one illness, one rent increase put them on the street. Many of them had no idea how many benefits, programs, and housing resources they were actually entitled to because nobody ever sat down and told them. In many cases, the paperwork that could have kept them housed existed the whole time, sitting in a filing cabinet in some office. They just never knew which office, which form, or who to ask, and the system almost never comes looking for you. That gap between the help that exists and the people who never find out about it is exactly why we put together a free guide called The Veteran's Blueprint. It walks through the benefits, housing programs, and money most veterans never claim, step by step, in far more detail than we could ever fit into a video. If you're a veteran, if money is tighter than anyone around you knows, or if you're trying to help someone in that spot, the link is in the description below. It's free, and it was built for exactly this. Now, back to Seattle. Because at some point, every taxpayer watching this asks the same fair question. What does all of this actually cost? The $4,500 figure is real, but it only covers the materials for the house itself. Once you add the land preparation, the utilities, the hygiene trailers, the round-the-clock staffing, And the case managers, the true cost comes to roughly $35,000 per tiny home per year, according to a report from the mayor's office. That sounds like a lot, until you compare it to the alternatives. Broken down per person, a night in a tiny house village costs the system around $38. A bed in an enhanced shelter costs about $56 a night. Putting someone up in a hotel room costs $130 a night or more. And doing nothing is the most expensive option of all, because a person living unsheltered cycles through emergency rooms, ambulances, police contacts, and jail stays that can quietly cost taxpayers tens of thousands of dollars a year, with nothing to show for it. Researchers who have followed chronically homeless individuals through public systems have documented cases where a single person costs the public well over $100,000 in a year, mostly in emergency care, without ever getting off the street. Against numbers like that, $38 a night starts to look less like charity and more like the fiscally conservative option. Seattle has done this math across multiple mayors from different political camps. One former mayor called the villages probably the city's most successful form of shelter at moving people into long-term housing. The current administration has identified $17.5 million to expand them. Today, there are more than 600 tiny homes across roughly 20 villages inside Seattle, and counting surrounding cities like Tacoma, Olympia, and Tukwila. The region has around 24 villages serving more than 2,000 people every year. But this story would be incomplete and honestly a little dishonest if we pretended everyone in Seattle loves these villages. They are genuinely controversial, and the criticism comes from two very different directions. From one side, neighbors. When the city announces a new village, nearby homeowners often push back hard. Some worry about crime and drug use. Some say the city made promises about oversight and communication and then broke them. Near one village, residents complained there was no accountability, that conditions around the site didn't match what officials had pledged. Supporters answer with the litter patrols, the fencing, the 24-hour staffing, and studies suggesting the villages don't drive up neighborhood crime. But the tension is real, and it flares up almost every time a new site is announced. Some villages have closed or relocated after their agreements with the city expired, and every closure reopens the same argument about where these communities belong and who gets to decide. From the other side, housing advocates make nearly the opposite argument. Their concern is that a 96-square-foot shed without plumbing is really just shelter with better branding. They worry that cities will build cheap villages, take the victory lap, and quietly stop funding the expensive part, actual affordable apartments. And they have a point worth taking seriously. Even the village's own operators agree on this. The tiny houses were never meant to be the destination. They're meant to be the bridge. A stable, dignified place to stand while a case manager helps you cross into permanent housing. So does the bridge actually lead anywhere? Here's what the evidence shows. People say yes to tiny houses at far higher rates than they say yes to traditional shelters. Outreach workers call the villages one of the few offers that people in encampments consistently accept, which matters enormously, because shelter you refuse helps no one. Once inside, connected to case management, a significant share of residents do move on to permanent housing, jobs, and reunited families. That track record is a big part of why the funding has survived changes in city leadership that quietly killed plenty of other programs. It is not everyone. Some residents stay in the villages far longer than the model intended, largely because the permanent, affordable housing they're supposed to graduate into barely exists. The bridge works. The far shore is still under construction. And that, more than anything, is the honest conclusion of this story. A $4,500 wooden house does not end homelessness. What it ends is the emergency. It ends the sleepless nights, the stolen belongings, the frostbite, the slow erosion of a person's dignity. It buys a human being the stability to become someone who can be helped. Volunteers with hammers can build one in days. And the model has now spread far beyond Seattle. In Los Angeles, rows of small prefabricated cabins now stand on land that used to be parking lots. Outside Austin, Texas, a nonprofit built an entire master-planned neighborhood of tiny homes, complete with gardens, workshops, and community dinners, housing hundreds of formerly homeless residents. Officials from dozens of cities have toured Seattle's villages, taken notes, and gone home to build their own versions. What started as a stopgap made of plywood and paint is quietly turning into national policy. 18,000 people are still homeless in the Seattle region tonight. About 750 of them will sleep in a tiny house instead of a tent, behind a locked door, in a warm bed, with their own key in their pocket. The question the rest of the country is now asking is a simple one. If a small wooden house and a caring community can do that much for that little, what exactly are we waiting for? If this video opened your eyes, subscribe. Because next we're looking at how one European country did what America hasn't, and effectively ended street homelessness altogether.